Welcome to the e-Pathshala on PG students. The subject is architecture, the paper is urban design, and the module is technology and urban design. Welcome to session 2. Session 2 describes the machine city and modernity. What we'll be discussing in this session is essentially looking at the invention of the modern age as well as the influence that technology had on this, and how both this idea of being modern and this idea of the omnipresence of technology shapes the city, and how fundamental it is to our understanding of urban design itself. Let's begin with the European Enlightenment. In the early 1700s and late 1600s, we start to see the emergence of Europe as we understand it today. Essentially, Europe for a very long time, if you describe European civilization, you were talking about the Mediterranean empires like Rome and Greece and so on. But in the 1600s, the center of gravity, or the cultural and political center of gravity after the Renaissance, shifts north towards the Atlantic. Countries like Britain, France, Germany start to become players on the world stage on a scale that they have never experienced before, and the world also starts to recognize them as such. In the 1700s, we start to see the emergence of the nation state in Europe, rivaling empires. You still had in 1700s the Ottoman Empire as well as the Habsburg Empire, or the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But then England, France, Spain, Portugal, all of these countries start to create this sense of nationhood, this sense of being a country, of being literally a nation, composed of people who speak similar languages, who have similar cultural habits, and who belong together. And this is a very important development in the evolution of what we now call the nation state, because we start to see this sense of nationhood emerging for the first time in Europe, which essentially rivals the traditional forms such as kingdoms and civilizations and empires. And this idea of the nation sweeps through Europe in the 1700s, and this happens through the European Enlightenment, which is crucial to our understanding of the modern age. In the 1600s, the Europeans embraced rationalism, exemplified by René Descartes' famous statement, cogito ergo sum, which means I think, therefore I am. And for the first time, the Europeans started to believe that solutions to their problems and solutions to their ideas of their issues and a way to understand the world was perhaps not through superstitions was not through superstition and or magic, but rather through a rational, logical understanding of the world. And this is also the great era of the great mathematicians such as Descartes, Fermat, Euler, and all of these people help educate the people on looking at the universe in a slightly more logical way, or embracing a slightly more logical manner of looking, slightly more logical universe itself. This leads to a number of great thinkers emerging in Europe. The person who best exemplifies this is Immanuel Kant, who is the father of the Enlightenment. He writes this famous book called A Critique of Pure Reason, which essentially starts to look at reason as a way of dealing with the universe, as opposed to a more as opposed to a more dogmatic and fundamentalist way of looking at it. We see people like Adam Smith, the father of modern economics, write his famous book on the wealth of nations, and and people start to look at money and the way in which money behaves and the way in which people behave with money, with regard to money, and start to look at economics as a very important aspect of how we understand the world. People like John Locke, who's a little older than the rest of the people portrayed here, start to look at what makes this, what the obligations of a country is to its people, and he writes, and he is one of the first people to talk of the social contract of what a country owes the people in return for allowing the government to rule. And this essentially is the foundation for our modern nation state as we understand it today. And people like Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote arguments against slavery and was one of the earliest feminists on record, starts to talk about the rights of women and the rights of subjugated people. And so there is a lot of discussion and a lot of thought that is building up in Europe at this time, and this leads to a number of very interesting intellectual achievements, some of which take on a political shape. This is, of course, the famous American Revolution, which was inspired by people like Locke. And then the American Revolution, in its stead, inspires the French Revolution, which is built on the backs of great intellectuals like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire, who are also part of this movement of enlightenment. All of these changes lead to the freezing of Europe as a nation state, and this creation of this great yearning to be part of this nation. And people start to develop flags. They start to develop the flags of their countries rather than the flags of their kings, and start to draw borders around Europe. And then we start to see the modernization of pretty much of the world as such begins with this understanding. But this is not. But these movements are not just restricted to politics alone. Science is revolutionized. People like Isaac Newton starts to radically change the way in which the universe was perceived, and this leads to a new form of understanding of the universe emerging. And people like Newton and the people around Newton and other natural philosophers, as the early scientists were known, start to talk about a new method of science itself. And this is what we now call the scientific method, which is based on something called inductive reasoning, which is essentially reasoning by creating a hypothesis and then testing the hypothesis through experiment. And this leads to experiments becoming public displays, and that is captured in this famous painting by Joseph Wright, where he shows a group of people looking at a bird in an air pump in one of the famous experiments of that time. And this is an engraving of Antoine Lavoisier's early experiments in chemistry, and this is a famous experiment called the flying boy, which demonstrates static electricity, as the boy is floating in the air and then he's charged with static current, and then the iron filings in the buckets below rise towards him, are drawn towards him. And essentially the scientific method, or a rational experimental way of looking at the world, changes almost everything. It changes our understanding of what makes what builds the universe, and it creates technology, it creates apparatus, and it uses technology and it to start to explain the universe. This is Robert Boyle's famous apparatus, that essentially creates the first air pump and explains things like air pressure. And this is possible through this new method of science of the 1700s. All of these random experiments then start to have practical applications, and Boyle's air pump eventually in some form leads to the rise of the steam engine by James Watt. And James Watt did not invent the steam engine, but he perfected it. And the steam engine is perhaps one of the most important inventions of all time, because for the first time we start to see the machine begin to drive economic growth. It begins to start to the machine itself begins to start providing people with jobs. It starts inventing new ways of doing things, and the steam engine is a crucial aspect of. And this kicks off the famous industrial revolution of the late 1700s and early 1800s, and people come rushing from the villages into the cities to get an opportunity to work on these steam pump, work on the steam engines, which are now producing things like cloth and machines and a number of other products which need labor, and people start to run from the villages into the cities to work in these groups of machines that are now called factories. And people then start to and people are now running in their thousands into cities to work in these factories and produce goods and service to produce goods that can be made cheaper and better than they ever were before. This also, but it's not just in the but the impact of the steam engine is not just in production of goods, but also in transport. And we see this in the emergence of the railroad as being the lifeline of most countries. And Britain was the pioneer of the railroad, of the early railroad, and then this goes on to America and eventually even to India. And people can now move across the country faster, safer, and better, and far more comfortably than they ever could even 10 or 15 years before the railroad was invented. This leads to the invention of engineering, and engineering becomes an independent profession in itself. People are no longer happy with just the architecture as a place to live in, but then start to look at engineering as architecture, but architecture that goes beyond just a place to live or a place to work. And engineering becomes a far more utilitarian branch of architecture as it's traditionally understood. The new materials that become possible because of the invention of the steam engine and the foundries that the steam engine drives is iron, and we see the emergence of cast iron and wrought iron becoming very crucial materials. And because these are old materials, but they can be produced in scales and in sizes that have never been seen before. And this is the famous cast iron bridge of 1781 built in Britain. It's a beautiful bridge, but what it symbolizes is the new technology of the iron industry that's happening. We then see the Brooklyn Bridge, which is the first suspended bridge in 1883, and this is far more technically advanced than the bridge we just saw earlier. And this also revolutionizes architecture, because we start to see the new materials. This is, of course, Joseph Paxton's famous Crystal Palace, which is the first glass and steel building being built, and it creates these amazing, interesting forms which have never been seen before. And this is a painting of what the interior of the Crystal Palace looked like, with its famous glass vault and the famous iron columns and frames. Incidentally, this was also possible because of the invention of a process to produce plate glass, which was not possible earlier, because glass in the medieval times was primarily restricted to tiny little pieces. But now you could produce sheets of glass, and an infinite number of sheets of glass that allowed buildings like the Crystal Palace to emerge. Another famous example is the Gallery of Machines produced for the Paris Expo in 1889, and this is one of the largest span structures and arguably one of the most beautiful iron structures ever produced. And people start to look at technology and science not just as something that certain people do, but they start to look at it as something that has not just utility in their lives, but also as something that should be displayed and exhibited, and something that can be looked at similar to what you would a painting or a sculpture. And these are a few objects showcased, and we start to see different movement systems within the gallery of machines of essentially a carriage that carriage on rails that runs horizontally and then runs vertically and carries people with it, displaying early forms of elevators and other movement systems. And we start to see this public interest in technology, and this is at the heart of the modern age, and this celebration of the machine as something that is not just utilitarian, but as something that is more than that, something that's aesthetic and something that's philosophically crucial to our understanding of what the modern age is. We then see the emergence of reinforced concrete. This is a drawing by Francois Henenbeek, and he invents a system which invented the methodology in which the rods were to be placed within reinforced concrete, and we start to see the emergence of concrete becoming perhaps 1,000 years after the end of the Romans. Concrete once again becomes this very important material, having been ignored for nearly 1,000 years before. And then engineering itself translates into something more than just this showcase or this display of science. It becomes this grand piece of art, and these are of course two famous works by Gustave Eiffel, which are the tower named after him in Paris, and his famous structure for the statue of his famous structure behind the skin of this Statue of Liberty. And this is what engineering achieves. Essentially, it becomes itself. It becomes something that can be as celebrated as architecture, and it becomes something that is far more technically that's its root is far more technocratic than the traditional architecture, which then starts to become something that is perceived as something far more aesthetic. But also, what is the impact that it has on the city? And London, which is at the heart of this industrial revolution, booms. It becomes something transformative. And this is a map of London in the 1700s. But by the 80s, and if you'll notice, the southern bank of the Thames is not that dense, and most of the population, as you can see, lives on the northern bank. But by the 1800s, London becomes this busy city that has absolutely no idea what it's getting into. It sees an influx of people from the villages, from the rural areas of Britain, flood the city, and the opportunities that industrialization provides allows London, or rather forces London to become a megalopolis at a time when there was no real understanding of what a city of this size would need to be. At the background of all of this creates this is this notion that the city needs to be improved, and the city needs to be perhaps remodeled to reflect its true glory and not necessarily reflect the poverty that the immigrants to the city bring into it. And this is a famous proposal by John Nash, who was the personal friend and architect of the Prince Regent of London, of Britain in the late 1700s. And John Nash produces this his great piece of urban design, which is Regency Street in London, and he starts to and the darkened portions of this map that you see are essentially his contribution, and he creates a link from St James Park on the left to the new Regent's Park on the right, and he essentially designs the entire street bit by bit and piece by piece. Uh, but and it's a beautiful piece of urban design, and it's an extremely famous piece of urban design. But however, this image that you see and the next one that you will see is essentially what he does to achieve his goal, and he demolishes a number of houses and tenements of the people living in this city. And this is a question that a lot of urban designers face even today, is what should be the price of urban design, what should we do in order to achieve urban design, and who are the people who pay this price that we extract from it. But nonetheless, even though at the time it was highly controversial, today it is one of the most visited landmarks, and Regent Street is one of the most important pieces of urban design that we will ever see. And that is the image above is Regency Street, and the image below is the famous Regency Crescent, which is at the heart of the proposal of John Nash. And London itself is changing in its not just in Nash's forced way, but also organically. And this is London in the 1700s, at the time of perhaps the Napoleonic Wars, and people like Jane Austen who were writing at that time. But by the time people like Charles Dickens start to write about London, it's transformed into something more than just a little provincial town. It becomes this place where thousands of people live in abject squalor and in horrible conditions. This is a famous series of paintings by Gustave Doré, which describe London of that time, and you can see through his paintings and through his sketches that London is a place filled with poverty and filled with misery, and people who come to this city are not necessarily in the best conditions. And people like Charles Dickens and his contemporaries start to question this, and they start to campaign to improve the city of London and improve its not just the living conditions, but also how the city looks. And this era is also is very powerful for the transformations that happened in the years that followed Dickens and all of the people who were situated in Victorian London at the time. And this condition of the poor of these cities, which are getting transformed into receptacles of people flooding the surrounding area, flooding from the surrounding areas into the heart of the city, is essentially becoming a problem, because we now have populations that are unsustainable. They're living in conditions that are abysmal by any standards. Yet there is, at the heart of it, there is a movement starting to emerge which starts to question whether the city should take better care of its most vulnerable populations. And Charles Dickens famously wrote about it. People like Victor Hugo in France wrote extensively about it in his books like Les Miserables. But it wasn't just, but fictional writers and fictional artists start to only look at a particular aspect of the city, or rather they can only look at the city as a mythological aspect thing. However, this starts to go down into people who are thinking about more than just stories, and that leads to the emergence of people like Karl Marx and Frederick Engels and a number of other people in a number of different parts of the world, starting to look at the plight of these industrial workers who are the backbone of this entire, of this great rush to cities and perhaps a rush to civilization. And they start to question what makes the city, they start to question what makes the city just, or they start to think about justice not just on the at the level of a country, but also start to think about justice at the level of a city. And this leads to a number of transformations which we will be discussing in part 2. So, and we've come to the end of and that leads us to the end of part 1. Now, part 1 has discussed essentially what led to this position of industrialization and what the intellectual heritage of that industrialization is, and the fact that this industrialization happened in this scale and on this level essentially creates two situations. The first of which we have discussed extensively in the last few minutes, is this influx of population and what to do with this population because it's so enormous. However, this also leads to another situation, which is something we'll be discussing in phase 2, in part 2 of this session, is the emergence of a group of people who celebrate this grand industrialization and who look at this at the impact that the machine has on the city and start to celebrate it. So, and these two concepts of the city, these two versions of the same enterprise, creates very interesting takes on very interesting manifestations in urban design, and that is at the heart of what we'll be discussing in part 2. Thank you.